Carina, can we bring you in? So you are part of the UCL Warning Research Centre. So you are very much both looking to the past, I think, but also looking to the future, seeing how we can sort of horizon scan and bring some real useful tools to the table. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you're doing over there?
Absolutely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you're joining us in the world. And it's pretty gloomy here in London, so sadly it doesn't feel like summer, but it's really great to be here. My name's Carina Fearnley, and as David said, I am Professor of Warnings and Science Communication and the founder and the director of the UCL Warning Research Centre, which is sadly, and I say this very unfortunately, the only warning research centre in the world that is dedicated to researching warnings. And one of the reasons that this centre stemmed is because of my own research in terms of looking at natural hazards. And then COVID came along, and it was really interesting to see how many of the same questions around risk, uncertainty, preparedness, early action and warnings were coming up. And actually, we could transfer our knowledge from different hazards. So I really was looking for a way for us to bring together our knowledge around warnings together and look across different geographies, different disciplines, different sectors, and so on. It's kind of interesting because we're talking about resilience today. So if we look at the UNDRR, Disaster Risk Reduction Office of the United Nations, they define it as the ability of a system, community or society exposed to a hazard to resist, accommodate, absorb, adapt to, transform and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. But what's really interesting is this ability of a system doesn't necessarily tell us how we do that, right? So I'm kind of interested more in how do we do that? So in a way, if we're thinking about resilience, my argument is that actually warning systems are really important as part of that resilience, because what warning systems do is they're not just the siren that goes off and goes, makes a noise, or the phone app or whatever. It's actually a whole system, and a truly effective warning system is one that brings together many, many, many different facets, including the detection of a hazard or threat and the monitoring of that, the communication of it to a wide group of different stakeholders, and for those stakeholders actually to be able to respond to it. There's not really much point in having a warning that you're going to die in 5 minutes if there's nothing you can do about it. It's kind of like a bit useless. So what we want to do is have warnings where people can actually take action. And if you think about it, if we want people to take action when we're getting a warning, then actually what we need to do is prepare for that. So then we need to think about, well, what can we do if there's a tsunami that's being generated? Is there any high ground? If not, can we build some high structures? And so within a warning system, we're thinking about who are the different users, who are the different stakeholders and actors involved in it. We're also thinking about what are the different hazards and threats that could possibly be involved in what's going on. And then we're trying to think about what's the best way of communicating with people? How can we get people to take actions? What planning do we need to do? So it's a really holistic system. And in many ways, I see a warning system as kind of the real toolkit in terms of implementing what I would call disaster risk reduction, because it's really making us think about these things in a prepared way. And what that does is, of course, build resilience. So I really think that warnings are a really critical part of our thinking of resilience. And we recently did a report for the National Preparedness Commission that looked at how can we enhance warnings. So it's really important that we make sure that we're doing our warnings as best as we can. We can learn from lots of different lessons around the world, and that's what we at the Warning Research Centre do. We're bringing together all of the various scholars, academics, practitioners, whether they're NGO, governments, businesses, and intergovernmental organisations, together to really discuss what we think is the best research, the best findings that we can have on how to think about how we can enhance warnings. And what's really interesting is that when we think about enhancing warnings, it's really all about, really good, strong communication, right? That's absolutely critical. We need to work across different silos, and that's ever so challenging. If we're dealing with a crisis, let's just go back to Fukushima, the incident in Tohoku crisis in 2011, we had an earthquake, a very large earthquake. We had a tsunami. We had a nuclear plant meltdown, creating contamination. We then had an electrical supply issue across the whole of Japan. And then later on, we had all sorts of fishing issues in terms of contamination of sea life. So we've got like these very complex situations where we're dealing with multiple hazards and threats at the same time. Some of those will be natural, some of them will be human. Having a tornado in the middle of a war zone, for example, or a health pandemic on top of that. We're living in an ever increasingly complex environment. And whether those hazards and threats are compounding, concurrent, or cascading, means that we have to talk to one another. And that means we've got to talk across those different silos. So whether you're working in the nuclear industry, what you're doing in terms of thinking about warnings and preparedness measures for a nuclear meltdown might actually be really useful for, say, the volcano community. Or it might be that surgeons who are doing checklists when they're doing their medical procedures is a really good way for people to think about flooding warnings. So we've not really explored these different, silos and how people are doing things. So that's one of the key things that we're interested in doing, is sharing that knowledge, but as part of that process, cutting across those different silos. And really, the key thing here is that warnings are inherently a social system. They're not the technology, they're actually the social system. They're about people and the people who are vulnerable. And so one of the big things that we've been working on recently is more around inclusivity and thinking about, well, who are we including in our warning systems, and are they going to get those warnings, and can they respond to them? People who are perhaps elderly or children, or people who are in prisons, or people who have mental health issues or illnesses. So it's really, women in many parts of the world are very much marginalized as well, and cannot respond or act to a warning without the permission or assistance of their husband or brother and so on. And that's just, whatever our political views, that's just the way it is in that nation. And so we have to try and work within those contexts to make sure we're trying to make those systems as inclusive as possible. And we've worked with the World Bank in terms of, generating a report on that, which is looking at various entry points. But then we also want to get those the warnings into action. And that's also a really hard thing, is because we like to talk about it, we like to do our check boxes, but how do we actually put those warnings into practice? And so thinking about, how do we do these? What are the mechanisms? And some of the things which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later, methods of co-production, working at a community level. And the beauty of doing warnings at a community level and having warnings that are part of the social fabric of a society, if you like, are really key, because what that means is that society is prepared for anything. It doesn't matter whether it's a tornado, a flood, a nuclear meltdown. They've got the mechanism of communication, discussion, understanding what processes need to happen in place, which is really, really good. And then I think finally, really, policy. It's really interesting, because as an academic, and I shouldn't be admitting this to you, but as an academic, I've been very unsuccessful in terms of getting funding for warning systems. And this is a really tragic thing, that there's just not been that much interest or in warning systems. It's just shocking if we think about the Boxing Day tsunami that happened in 2004, Tohoku, COVID, even with the pandemic treaty that's going on now, and they're still struggling with that. But what's been really exciting just in the recent years has been the UN Secretary General's call to create warnings for all, early warnings for all. And so this is a global program that is really focused on trying to bring those nations that do not have warning systems or have very poor warning systems in place, particularly for meteorological, weather hazards, hence my weather background. For those of you that are curious, this is the 1987 hurricane in the UK warning forecast that Michael Fish faithfully gave, saying that everything was going to be okay. But these policies are really, really important, and they are starting to gain attention. And what's really wonderful is that people are talking about warnings now, and they are talking about how can we build warnings into our resilience plans? How can we prepare better? So it's I think that warnings are that really crucial tool. They're like a real hands-on tool, the how do we do things part of building our resilience. And there's a long, long way to go, because essentially, as you may have gathered, it covers every geography, every discipline, every type of people, everything from technology to art to oral history to satellite imagery to social media to, literally smoke signals. So it's a very, very complex problem. So I'm really excited to talk about that more with you all over the coming hour.
Carina, thank you. Of course, the thing about it is as risk managers, we get up every morning and we ask a fundamental, simple question. Are we ready? That is the fundamental question. Are we ready? And of course, warning signals is part of what allows us to do that. And one of the things that we talk about in the ISRM is very much about, if you want to be resilient, you have to have a sensitivity to your environment. And you have to have a sensitivity to changes in your environment on one side. And on the other side, you have to have the emotional readiness to do something about it. And that's why we saw in COVID. COVID was a fantastic example. Everybody knew that the planet was vulnerable to pandemic emergent infectious disease. I mean, we just knew that. We'd had Zika, and we'd had MERS, and we had SARS, and we'd had Ebola, and we'd had, a whole load of stuff. This was not unknown. And yet when it actually hit, it was like, oh my God, we hadn't actually thought about this. And it seemed that the world was just not ready for it. And being ready is part of the game, isn't it? So thank you for that. I mean, I'm very much looking forward to seeing how we can expand on that as well.